Hanaki. Did you know that our souls are connected by fate? Well, what do you know? I'm Yuno Hanaki from Production Kawaii's Hanamizuki. Good evening. I suppose you all have had a good evening so far? I hope you're here to wind down at least. The goal is for this to be a very relaxing time, so I hope you'll understand if we keep things very low energy, very mellow, very slow. We will mostly be focusing on the stories. What about me? I've been alright. I had dinner, I got ready for bed. I do have a couple things to take care of after all of this, but that's nothing for you to worry about. Let your big sister handle it, okay? Also, no worries if you can't really keep up with chatting. The goal of this stream is to be relaxing enough for you to fall asleep to, so there's no pressure. Isn't this technically an ASMR stream? I suppose you could look at it like that. I'm not really using a proper ASMR setup, so it doesn't really make sense for me to call it ASMR. But I guess using a quiet voice does make it a little bit close to it. Just something for the calm, as long as it's calming, I suppose. If it gives you tingles, it's ASMR. I've never really heard that. But I feel like it would be inappropriate to label it as such since I am not using an ASMR microphone. I'm just using a lower tone of voice. I don't really think that counts. But that's just me. Okay. I guess I will go ahead and get into the actual stories in question. As I said, we might mostly be focusing on the stories. There might be a small break in between, but for now, it's just story time. I'm going to be reading mostly classic fairy tales, so I hope that that is okay. Admittedly, part of me is a little bit nervous. I hope I can make this interesting. This was another incentive from Christmas that I intended to fulfill, so I hope that this is an acceptable way to fulfill it. Alright. Settle in. Get comfy. Feel free to use my lap as a pillow if you would like. We'll be starting with the Ugly Duckling. It was lovely summer weather in the country, and the golden corn, the green oats, and the haystacks piled up in the meadows looked beautiful. The stork walking about on his long red legs chattered in the Egyptian language which he had learnt from his mother. The cornfields and meadows were surrounded by large forests, in the midst of which were deep pools. It was indeed delightful to walk about in the country. In a sunny spot stood a pleasant old farmhouse, close by a deep river, and from the house down to the waterside grew great burdock leaves, so high that under the tallest of them a little child could stand upright. The spot was as wild as the center of a thick wood. In this snug retreat sat a duck on her nest, watching for her young brood to hatch. She was beginning to get tired of her task, for the little ones were a long time coming out of their shells, and she seldom had any visitors. The other ducks liked much better to swim about in the river than to climb the slippery banks and sit under a burdock leaf to have a gossip with her. At length one shell cracked, and then another. And from each egg came a living creature that lifted its head and cried, "Peep, peep!" "Quack, quack," said the mother, and then they all quacked as well as they could, and looked about them on every side at the large green leaves. Their mother allowed them to look as much as they liked, because green is good for the eyes. "How large the world is," said the young ducks when they found how much more room they now had than while they were inside the eggshell. "Do you imagine this is the whole world?" asked the mother. "Wait till you have seen the garden. It stretches far beyond that to the parson's field, but I have never ventured to such a distance. Are you all out?" she continued, rising. "No, I declare, the largest egg lies there still. I wonder how long this is to last. I am quite tired of it." And she seated herself again on the nest. "Well, how are you getting on?" asked an old duck who paid her a visit. "One egg is not hatched yet," said the duck. "It will not break. But just look at all the others. Are they not the prettiest little ducklings you ever saw? They are the image of their father, who is so unkind he never comes to see." "Let me see the egg that will not break," said the duck. "I have no doubt it is a turkey's egg. I was persuaded to hatch some once, and after all my care and trouble with the young ones, they were afraid of the water. I quacked and clucked, but all to no purpose. I cannot get them to venture in. Let me look at the egg. Yes, that is a turkey's egg. Take my advice, leave it where it is, and teach the other children to swim." "I think I will sit on it a little while longer," said the duck. "As I have sat so long already, a few days will be nothing." "Please yourself," said the old duck, and she went away. At last the large egg broke, and a young one crept forth, crying, "Peep, peep!" It was very large and ugly. The duck stared at it and exclaimed, "It is very large and not at all like the others. I wonder if it really is a turkey." We shall soon find it out, however, when we go to the water. It must go in, if I have to push it myself. On the next day the weather was delightful, and the sun shone brightly on the green burdock leaves. So the mother duck took her young brood down to the water and jumped in with a splash. "Quack, quack," cried she, and one after another the little ducklings jumped in. The water closed over their heads, but they came up again in an instant, and swam about quite prettily with their legs paddling under them as easily as possible. And the ugly duckling was also in the water, swimming with them. "Oh," said the mother, "that is not a turkey. How well he uses his legs, and how upright he holds himself. He is my own child, and he is not so very ugly after all if you look at him properly. Quack, quack. Come with me now. I will take you into grand society and introduce you to the farmyard, but you must keep close to me or you may be trodden upon. And above all, beware of the cat." When they reached the farmyard, there was a great disturbance. 2 families were fighting for an eel's head, which, after all, was carried off by the cat. "See, children, that is the way of the world," said the mother duck, wetting her beak, for she would have liked the eel's head herself. "Come now, use your legs, and let me see how well you can behave. You must bow your heads prettily to that old duck yonder. She is the highest born of them all, and has Spanish blood, therefore she is well off. Don't you see she has a red flag tied to her leg, which is something very grand and a great honor for a duck? It shows that everyone is anxious not to lose her, as she can be recognized both by man and beast. Come now, don't turn your toes. A well-bred duckling spreads his feet wide apart, just like his father and mother, in this way. Now bend your neck and say quack." The ducklings did as they were bid, but the other duck stared, and said, "Look, here comes another brood, as if there were not enough of us already. And what a queer-looking object one of them is. We don't want him here." And then one flew out and bit him in the neck. "Let him alone," said the mother. "He is not doing any harm." "Yes, but he is so big and ugly," said the spiteful duck, "and therefore he must be turned out." "The others are very pretty children," said the old duck with the rag on her leg. "All but that one. I wish his mother could improve him a little." "That is impossible, your grace," replied the mother. "He is not pretty, but he has a very good disposition, and swims as well or even better than the others. I think he will grow up pretty, and perhaps be smaller. He has remained too long in the egg, and therefore his figure is not properly formed." And then she stroked his neck and smoothed the feathers, saying, "It is a drake, and therefore not of so much consequence. I think he will grow up strong, and able to take care of himself." "The other ducklings are graceful enough," said the old duck. "Now make yourself at home, and if you can find an eel's head, you can bring it to me." And so they made themselves comfortable. But the poor duckling, who had crept out of his shell last of all and looked so ugly, was bitten and pushed and made fun of, not only by the ducks but by all the poultry. He is too big, they all said, and the turkey, who had been born into the world with spurs and fancied himself really an emperor, pulled himself out like a vessel in full sail and flew at the duckling, and became quite red in the head with passion, so that the poor little thing did not know where to go, and was quite miserable because he was so ugly and laughed at by the whole farmyard. So it went on from day to day, till it got worse and worse. The poor duckling was driven about by everyone. Even his brothers and sisters were unkind to him, and would say, "Ah, you ugly creature, I wish the cat would get you." And his mother said she wished he had never been born. The ducks pecked him, the chickens beat him, and the girl who fed the poultry kicked him with her feet. So at last he ran away, frightening the little birds in the hedge as he flew over the palings. "They are afraid of me because I am ugly," he said. So he closed his eyes and flew still farther, until he came out on a large moor inhabited by wild ducks. Here he remained the whole night, feeling very tired and sorrowful. In the morning, when the wild ducks rose in the air, they stared at their new comrade. "What sort of duck are you?" they all said, coming around him. He bowed to them and was as polite as he could be, but he did not reply to their question. "You are exceedingly ugly," said the wild ducks, "but that will not matter if you do not want to marry one of our family." Poor thing! He had no thoughts of marriage. All he wanted was permission to lie among the rushes and drink some of the water on the moor. After he had been on the moor 2 days, there came 2 wild geese, or rather goslings, for they had not been out of the egg long and were very saucy. "Listen, friend," said one of them to the duckling, "you are so ugly that we like you very well. Will you go with us and become a bird of passage? Not far from here is another moor, in which there are some pretty wild geese, all unmarried. It is a chance for you to get a wife. You may be lucky, ugly as you are." Pop, pop sounded in the air, and the 2 wild geese fell dead among the rushes, and the water was tinged with blood. Pop, pop echoed far and wide in the distance, and the whole flocks of wild geese rose up from the rushes. The sound continued from every direction, for the sportsmen surrounded the moor, and some were even seated on branches of trees overlooking the rushes. The blue smoke from the guns rose like clouds over the dark trees, and as it floated away across the water, a number of sporting dogs bounded in among the rushes, which bent beneath them wherever they went. How they terrified the poor duckling! He turned away his head to hide it under his wing, and at the same moment a large, terrible dog passed quite near him. His jaws were open, his tongue hung from his mouth, and his eyes glared fearfully. He thrust his nose close to the duckling, showing his sharp teeth, and then, splash, splash, he went into the water without touching him. "Oh," sighed the duckling, "how thankful I am for being so ugly. Even a dog will not bite me." And so he lay quite still while a shot rattled through the rushes, and gun after gun was fired over him. It was late in the day before all became quiet, but even then the poor young thing did not dare to move. He waited quietly for several hours, and then, after looking carefully around him, hastened away from the moor as fast as he could. He ran over field and meadow till a storm arose, and he could hardly struggle against it. Towards evening, he reached a poor little cottage that seemed ready to fall, and only remained standing because it could not decide on which side to fall first. The storm continued so violent that the duckling could go no farther. He sat down by the cottage, and then he noticed that the door was not quite closed, in consequence of one of the hinges having given way. There was therefore a narrow opening near the bottom, large enough for him to slip through, which he did very quietly, and got a shelter for the night. A woman, a tomcat, and a hen lived in this cottage. The tomcat, whom the mistress called my little son, was a great favorite. He could raise his back and purr, and could even throw out sparks from his fur if it were stroked the wrong way. The hen had very short legs, so she was called Chickie Shortlegs. She laid good eggs, and her mistress loved her as if she had been her own child. In the morning the strange visitor was discovered, and the tomcat began to purr and the hen to cluck. "What is that noise about?" said the old woman, looking round the room, but her sight was not very good. Therefore, when she saw the duckling, she thought it must be a fat duck that had strayed from home. "Oh, what a prize!" she exclaimed. "I hope it is not a drake, for then I shall have some duck's eggs. I must wait and see." So the duckling was allowed to remain on trial for 3 weeks, but there were no eggs. Now the tomcat was the master of the house, and the hen was mistress, and they always said, "we and the world," for they believed themselves to be half the world, and the better half too. The duckling thought that others might hold a different opinion on the subject, but the hen would not listen to such doubts. "Can you lay eggs?" she asked. "No." "Then have the goodness to hold your tongue." "Can you raise your back, or purr, or throw out sparks?" said the tomcat. "No." "Then you have no right to express an opinion when sensible people are speaking." So the duckling sat in a corner, feeling very low-spirited, till the sunshine and the fresh air came into the room through the open door. And then he began to feel such a great longing for a swim on the water that he could not help telling the hen. "What an absurd idea," said the hen. "You have nothing else to do, therefore you have foolish fancies. If you could purr or lay eggs, they would pass away." "But it is so delightful to swim about on the water," said the duckling, "and so refreshing to feel it close over your head while you dive down to the bottom." "Delightful indeed," said the hen. "Why, you must be crazy. Ask the cat. He is the cleverest animal I know. Ask him how he would like to swim about on the water, or to dive under it, for I will not speak of my own opinion. Ask our mistress, the old woman. There is no one in the world more clever than she is. Do you think she would like to swim, or let the water close over her head?" "You don't understand me," said the duckling. "We don't understand you? Who can understand you, I wonder? Do you consider yourself more clever than the cat or the old woman? I will say nothing of myself. Don't imagine such nonsense, child, and think your good fortune that you have been received here. Are you not in a warm room, and in society from which you may learn something? But you are a chatterer, and your company is not very agreeable. Believe me, I speak only for your own good. I may tell you unpleasant truths, but that is a proof of my friendship. I advise you, therefore, to lay eggs and learn to purr as quickly as possible." "I believe I must go out into the world again," said the duckling. "Yes, do," said the hen. So the duckling left the cottage, and soon found water on which it could swim and dive, but was avoided by all other animals because of its ugly appearance. Autumn came, and the leaves in the forest turned to orange and gold. Then, as winter approached, the wind caught them as they fell and whirled them in the cold air. The clouds, heavy with hail and snowflakes, hung low in the sky, and the raven stood on the ferns crying, "Croak, croak." It made one shiver with cold to look at him. All this was very sad for the poor little duckling. One evening, just as the sun set amid radiant clouds, there came a large flock of beautiful birds out of the bushes. The duckling had never seen any like them before. They were swans, and they curved their graceful necks while their soft plumage shone with dazzling whiteness. They uttered a single cry as they spread their glorious wings and flew away from those cold regions to warmer countries across the sea. As they mounted higher and higher in the air, the ugly little duckling felt quite a strange sensation as he watched them. He whirled himself in the water like a wheel, stretched out his neck toward them, and uttered a cry so strange that it frightened himself. Could he ever forget those beautiful, happy birds? And when at last they were out of his sight, he dived under the water, and rose again almost beside himself with excitement. He knew not the names of these birds, nor where they had flown, but he felt towards them as he had never felt for any other bird in the world. He was not envious of these beautiful creatures, but wished to be as lovely as they. Poor ugly creature, how gladly he would have lived even with the ducks had they only given him encouragement. The winter grew colder and colder. He was obliged to swim about on the water to keep it from freezing, but every night the space on which he swam became smaller and smaller. At length it froze so hard that the ice in the water crackled as he moved, and the duckling had to paddle with his legs as well as he could to keep the space from closing up. He became exhausted at last and lay still and helpless, frozen fast in the ice. Early in the morning, a peasant who was passing by saw what had happened. He broke the ice in pieces with his wooden shoe and carried the duckling home to his wife. The warmth revived the poor little creature, but when the children wanted to play with him, the duckling thought they would do him some harm. So he started up in terror, fluttered into the milk pan, and splashed the milk about the room. Then the woman clapped her hands, which frightened him still more. He flew first into the butter cask, then into the meal tub, and out again. What a condition he was in! The woman screamed and struck at him with the tongs. The children laughed and screamed and tumbled over each other in their efforts to catch him, but luckily he escaped. The door stood open. The poor creature could just manage to slip out among the bushes and lie down quite exhausted in the newly fallen snow. It would be very sad were I to relate all the misery and privations which the poor little duckling endured during the hard winter. But when it had passed, he found himself lying one morning in a moor amongst the rushes. He felt the warm sun shining, and heard the lark singing, and saw that all around was beautiful spring. Then the young bird felt that his wings were strong, as he flapped them against his sides, and rose high into the air. They bore him onwards until he found himself in a large garden, before he well knew how it had happened. The apple trees were in full blossom, and the fragrant elders bent their long green branches down to the stream, which wound round a smooth lawn. Everything looked beautiful in the freshness of early spring. From a thicket close by came 3 beautiful white swans, rustling their feathers, and swimming lightly over the smooth water. The duckling remembered the lovely birds and felt more strangely unhappy than ever. "I will fly to those royal birds," he exclaimed, "and they will kill me because I am so ugly and dare to approach them, but it does not matter. Better be killed by them than pecked by the ducks, beaten by the hens, pushed about by the maiden who feeds the poultry, or starved with hunger in the winter." Then he flew to the water and swam towards the beautiful swans. The moment they espied the stranger, they rushed to meet him with outstretched wings. "Kill me," said the poor bird, and he bent his head down to the surface of the water and awaited death. But what did he see in the clear stream below? His own image. No longer a dark gray bird, ugly and disagreeable to look at, but a graceful and beautiful swan. To be born in a duck's nest in a farmyard is of no consequence to a bird if it is hatched from a swan's egg. He now felt glad at having suffered sorrow and trouble, because it enabled him to enjoy so much better all the pleasure and happiness around him. For the great swans swam round the newcomer and stroked his neck with their beaks as a welcome. Into the garden presently came some little children, and threw bread and cake into the water. "See," cried the youngest, "there is a new one." And the rest were delighted, and ran to their father and mother, dancing and clapping their hands and shouting joyously, "There is another swan come! A new one has arrived!" Then they threw more bread and cake into the water and said, "The new one is the most beautiful of all. He is so young and pretty." And the old swans bowed their heads before him. Then he felt quite ashamed and hid his head under his wing, for he did not know what to do. He was so happy, and yet not at all proud. He had been persecuted and despised for his ugliness, and now he heard them say that he was the most beautiful of all the birds. Even the elder tree bent down its boughs into the water before him, and the sun shone warm and bright. Then he rustled his feathers, curved his slender neck, and cried joyfully from the depths of his heart, "I never dreamed of such happiness as this, while I was an ugly duckling." The end. That is the Hans Christian Andersen version. I've never actually read that one. So that was a first experience for me as well. A lot sadder than previous versions of The Ugly Duckling, but still ended with a bit of happiness, even if it was a little melancholy. So the beautiful swan is Yuno? Are you saying that the swan is the equivalent of your big sister? I suppose so. Moral of the story, be ugly. It seems so. Or at the very least, do not be so ashamed of your ugliness, for one day you will be surrounded by people who find you beautiful. Finding your like-minded people and all of that. You need a hug after that one. It's alright. Come here. That's what your big sister is here for. That doesn't sound realistic. Well, are you really looking for realism in a short story? You said you were nervous about it before, but you're doing great. Well, thank you. I'm doing my best. That's really all I can do. Beauty formed through trials? Exactly. While he did have to face a lot of adversity, he was still able to find his own inner beauty because he never turned ugly. Well, ugly in spirit. Many people, when faced with such adversity, would end up resorting to cruelty, you know? But the important thing is that this young duckling was always kind and polite and respectful. Okay. Let's pick out another story. Let's see. This one is much shorter, but I thought it would be a nice one to read too. He stayed a good lad. That's a good lesson to all of you. Remember to stay good even when you are faced with such adversity. So this story is a Chinese fable called How the Moon Became Beautiful. The moon is very beautiful, with his round, bright face which shines with soft and gentle light on all the world of man. But once, there was a time when he was not so beautiful as he is now. 6,000 years ago, the face of the moon became changed in a single night. Before that time, his face had been so dark and gloomy that no one liked to look at him, and for this reason he was always very sad. One day he complained to the flowers and to the stars, for they were the only things that would ever look in his face. He said, "I do not like to be the moon. I wish I were a star or a flower. If I were a star, even the smallest one, some great general would care for me. But alas, I am only the moon, and no one likes me. If I could only be a flower, and grow in a garden where the beautiful earth women come, they would place me in their hair and praise my fragrance and beauty. Or, if I could even grow in the wilderness where no one could see, the birds would surely come and sing sweet songs for me. But I am only the moon, and no one honors me." The stars answered and said, "We cannot help you. We were born here, and we cannot leave our places. We never had anyone to help us. We do our duty, we work all the day and twinkle in the dark night to make the skies more beautiful. But that is all we can do," they added, as they smiled coldly at the sorrowful moon. Then the flowers smiled sweetly and said, "We do not know how we can help you. We live always in one place, in a garden near the most beautiful maiden in all the world. As she is kind to everyone in trouble, we will tell her about you. We love her very much, and she loves us. Her name is Senio." Still, the moon was sad. So one evening, he went to see the beautiful maiden Senio, and when he saw her, he loved her at once. He said, "Your face is very beautiful. I wish that you would come to me, and that my face would be as your face. Your motions are gentle and full of grace. Come with me, and we will be as one, and perfect. I know that even the worst people in all the world would have only to look at you and they would love you. Tell me, how did you come to be so beautiful?" "I have always lived with those who are gentle and happy, and I believe that is the cause of beauty and goodness," answered Senio. And so the moon went every night to see the maiden. He knocked on her window, and she came. And when he saw how gentle and beautiful she was, his love grew stronger, and he wished more and more to be with her always. One day, Senio said to her mother, "I should like to go to the moon and live always with him. Will you allow me to go?" Her mother thought so little of the question that she made no reply, and Senio told her friends that she was going to be the moon's bride. In a few days, she was gone. Her mother searched everywhere but could not find her, and one of Senio's friends said, "She has gone with the moon, for he asked her many times." A year and a year passed by, and Senio, the gentle and beautiful earth maiden, did not return. Then the people said, "She has gone forever. She is with the moon." The face of the moon is very beautiful now. It is happy and bright, and gives a soft, gentle light to all the world. And there are those who say that the moon is now like Senio, who was once the most beautiful of all earth maidens. That's an interesting one. Another story I've never heard. The idea that a beautiful maiden was the one that fused with the moon to make it more pretty. I guess it's implying that the moon used to be quite dark before, or always dark. An interesting interpretation. Okay. A few more. Maybe that's where Avatar got it from? My girlfriend became the moon. That's rough, buddy. I've never actually watched Avatar, but I do know of that scene. Good night. Sleep well. Alright, let's see. On to the next one. Or maybe not this one, because this is multiple chapters. I did not realize. Different one. Okay. Let's do the Three Little Pigs. Once upon a time, there was an old mother pig who had 3 little pigs and not enough food to feed them. So when they were old enough, she sent them out into the world to seek their fortunes. The first little pig was very lazy. He didn't want to work at all, and he built his house out of straw. The second little pig worked a little bit harder, but he was somewhat lazy too, and he built his house out of sticks. Then they sang and danced and played together the rest of the day. The third little pig worked hard all day and built his house with bricks. It was a sturdy house, complete with a fine fireplace and chimney. It looked like it could withstand the strongest winds. The next day, a wolf happened to pass by the lane where the 3 little pigs lived, and he saw the straw house and he smelled the pig inside. He thought the pig would make a mighty fine meal, and his mouth began to water. So he knocked on the door and said, little pig, let me in, let me in." But the little pig saw the wolf's big paws through the keyhole, so he answered back, "No, no, no, not by the hairs on my chinny chin chin." Then the wolf showed his teeth and said, "Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house down." So he huffed and he puffed and he blew the house down. The wolf opened his jaws very wide and bit down as hard as he could, but the first little pig escaped and ran away to hide with the second little pig. The wolf continued down the lane, and he passed by the second house made of sticks, and he saw the house, and he smelled the pigs inside, and his mouth began to water as he thought about the fine dinner they would make. So he knocked on the door and said, little pigs, let me in, let me in." But the little pigs saw the wolf's pointy ears through the keyhole, so they answered back, "No, no, no, not by the hairs on our chinny chin chin." So the wolf showed his teeth and said, "Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house down." So he huffed and he puffed and he blew the house down. The wolf was greedy, and he tried to catch both pigs at once, but he was too greedy and got neither. His big jaws clamped down on nothing but air, and the 2 little pigs scrambled away as fast as their little hooves would carry them. The wolf chased them down the lane, and he almost caught them, but they made it to the brick house and slammed the door closed before the wolf could catch them. The 3 little pigs, they were very frightened. They knew the wolf wanted to eat them, and that was very, very true. The wolf hadn't eaten all day, and he had worked up a large appetite chasing the pigs around. And now he could smell all 3 of them inside, and he knew that the 3 little pigs would make a lovely feast. So the wolf knocked on the door and said, little pigs, let me in, let me in." But the little pigs saw the wolf's narrow eyes through the keyhole, so they answered back, "No, no, no, not by the hairs on our chinny chin chin." So the wolf showed his teeth and said, "Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house down." Well, he huffed and he puffed. He puffed and he huffed, and he huffed, and he puffed, but he could not blow the house down. At last he was so out of breath that he couldn't huff and he couldn't puff anymore. So he stopped to rest and thought a bit. But this was too much. The wolf danced about with rage and swore he would come down the chimney and eat up the little pig for his supper. But while he was climbing onto the roof, the little pig made up a blazing fire and put on a big pot full of water to boil. Then, just as the wolf was coming down the chimney, the little pig pulled off the lid and plop! In fell the wolf into the scalding water. So the little piggy put on the cover again, boiled the wolf up, and the 3 little pigs ate him for supper. What sort of lesson do we take from this one, The dark turn? I'm pretty sure that's how the story has always ended. Or at the very least, the wolf does usually end up burned and roasted in some form. Maybe the pigs don't always eat him, but this is the most accurate depiction of the fairy tale that exists. Don't trust pigs to build houses. That is fair. Well, besides one. Some pigs are quite lazy. Don't ask the pigs for a cup of sugar. Understandable. Especially not if you're a wolf, for some reason. I never remember the wolf being boiled alive. Well, this version is based on the oldest depiction of the 3 little pigs, which is from 1922. Bro isn't going to be in the sequel. Now, don't make fun of him. He did just receive his comeuppance, though. Okay. Was the wolf killed by the pigs? Yes, he was boiled. A lot of these fairy tales end up being quite darker in their original depictions. I think it's only fair that you understand the true version of it, rather than one that's too heavily censored. Exactly, wolf soup. The only thing that I don't quite like about it is that they didn't take the fur off, so that means it's a very furry soup. I can't say that would be particularly delicious in my opinion. Okay, this story is usually told around Christmas time, so you'll have to forgive the fact that it's not particularly timely, but I still think that it would be a good story to tell, so I'm going to tell it anyways. I'm imagining the texture. It is probably not very good. And yes, it is true the pigs wouldn't mind, for they are animals, but I don't think I would like that very much either. Okay. The Velveteen Rabbit. There was once a Velveteen Rabbit, and in the beginning he was really splendid. He was fat and bunchy, as a rabbit should be. His coat was spotted brown and white, he had real thread whiskers, and his ears were lined with pink satin. On Christmas morning, when he sat wedged in the top of the boy's stocking with a sprig of holly between his paws, the effect was charming. There were other things in the stocking: nuts and oranges and a toy engine, chocolate almonds and a clockwork mouse, but the rabbit was quite the best of all. For at least 2 hours the boy loved him, and then aunts and uncles came to dinner, and there was a great rustling of tissue paper and unwrapping of parcels, and in the excitement of looking at all the new presents, the Velveteen Rabbit was forgotten. For a long time he lived in the toy cupboard or on the nursery floor, and no one thought very much about him. He was naturally shy, and being only made of velveteen, some of the more expensive toys quite snubbed him. The mechanical toys were very superior and looked down upon everyone else. They were full of modern ideas and pretended they were real. The model boat, who had lived through 2 seasons and lost most of his paint, caught the tone from them and never missed an opportunity of referring to his rigging in technical terms. The rabbit could not claim to be a model of anything, for he didn't know that real rabbits existed. He thought they were all stuffed with sawdust like him, and he understood that sawdust was quite out of date and should never be mentioned in modern circles. Even Timothy, the jointed wooden lion who was made by the disabled soldiers and should have had broader views, put on airs and pretended he was connected with the government. Between them all, the poor little rabbit was made to feel himself very insignificant and commonplace, and the only person who was kind to him at all was the skin horse. The skin horse had lived longer in the nursery than any of the others. He was so old that his brown coat was bald in patches and showed the seams underneath, and most of the hairs in his tail had been pulled out to string bead necklaces. He was wise, for he had seen a long succession of mechanical toys arrive to boast and swagger, and by break their mainsprings and pass away, and he knew that they were only toys and would never turn into anything else. For nursery magic is very strange and wonderful, and only those playthings that are old and wise and experienced like the skin horse understand all about it. "What is real?" asked the rabbit one day when they were lying side by side near the nursery fender before Nana came to tidy the room. "Does it mean having things that buzz inside you and a stick-out handle?" "Real isn't how you are made," said the skin horse. "It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real." "Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit. "Sometimes," said the skin horse, for he was always truthful. "When you are real, you don't mind being hurt." "Does it happen all at once, like being wound up?" he asked. "Or bit by bit?" "It doesn't happen all at once," said the skin horse. "You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't often happen to people who break easily, or who have sharp edges, or who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand." "I suppose you are real?" said the rabbit. And then he wished he had not said it, for he thought the skin horse might be sensitive, but the skin horse only smiled. "The boy's uncle made me real," he said. "That was a great many years ago. But once you are real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always." The rabbit sighed. He thought it would be a long time before this magic called real happened to him. He longed to become real, to know what it felt like. And yet the idea of growing shabby and losing his eyes and whiskers was rather sad. He wished that he could become it without these uncomfortable things happening to him. There was a person called Nana who ruled the nursery. Sometimes she took no notice of the playthings lying about, and sometimes, for no reason whatsoever, she went swooping about like a great wind and hustled them away in cupboards. She called this tidying up, and the playthings all hated it, especially the tin ones. The rabbit didn't mind it so much, for whenever he was thrown, he came down soft. One evening, when the boy was going to bed, he couldn't find the china dog that always slept with him. Nana was in a hurry, and it was too much trouble to hunt for china dogs at bedtime, so she simply looked about her, and seeing that the toy cupboard's door stood open, she made a swoop. "Here," she said, "take your old bunny. He'll do to sleep with you." She dragged the rabbit out by one ear and put him into the boy's arms. That night, and for many nights after, the Velveteen Rabbit slept in the boy's bed. At first he found it rather uncomfortable, for the boy hugged him very tight. Sometimes he rolled over on him, and sometimes he pushed him so far under the pillow that the rabbit could scarcely breathe. And he missed, too, those long moonlight hours in the nursery, when all the house was silent and all his talks with the skin horse. But very soon he grew to like it, for the boy used to talk to him and made nice tunnels for him under the bedclothes that he said were like the burrows the real rabbits lived in. And they had splendid games together, in whispers, when Nana had gone away to her supper and left the nightlight burning on the mantelpiece. And when the boy dropped off to sleep, the rabbit would snuggle down close under his little warm chin and dream, with the boy's hands clasped close round him all night long. And so time went on, and the little rabbit was very happy. So happy that he never noticed how his beautiful velveteen fur was getting shabbier and shabbier, and his tail coming unsewn, and all the pink rubbed off his nose where the boy had kissed him. Spring came, and they had long days in the garden, for wherever the boy went, the rabbit went too. He had rides in the wheelbarrow and picnics on the grass, and lovely fairy huts built for him under the raspberry canes behind the flower border. And once, when the boy was called away suddenly to go out to tea, the rabbit was left out on the lawn until long after dusk, and Nana had to come and look for him with the candle because the boy couldn't go to sleep unless he was there. He was wet through with the dew and quite earthy from diving into the burrows the boy had made for him in the flower bed, and Nana grumbled as she rubbed him off with a corner of her apron. "You must have your old bunny," she said. "Fancy all that fuss for a toy." The boy sat up in bed and stretched out his hands. "Give me my bunny," he said. "You mustn't say that. He isn't a toy. He's real." When the little rabbit heard that, he was happy, for he knew that what the skin horse had said was true at last. The nursery magic had happened to him, and he was a toy no longer. He was real. The boy himself had said it. That night he was almost too happy to sleep, and so much love stirred in his little sawdust heart that it almost burst. And into his boot-button eyes that had long ago lost their polish there came a look of wisdom and beauty, so that even Nana noticed it next morning when she picked him up, and said, "I declare, if that old bunny hasn't got quite a knowing expression." That was a wonderful summer. Near the house where they lived was a wood, and in the long June evenings the boy liked to go there after tea to play. He took the Velveteen Rabbit with him, and before he wandered off to pick flowers or play at brigands among the trees, he always made the rabbit a little nest somewhere among the bracken, where he would be quite cozy, for he was a kind-hearted little boy and he liked Bunny to be comfortable. One evening, while the rabbit was lying there alone, watching the ants that ran to and fro between his velvet paws in the grass, he saw two strange beings creep out of the tall bracken near him. They were rabbits like himself, but quite furry and brand new. They must have been very well made, for their seams didn't show at all, and they changed shape in a queer way when they moved. One minute they were long and thin, and the next minute fat and bunchy, instead of always staying the same like he did. Their feet padded softly on the ground, and they crept quite close to him, twitching their noses, while the rabbit stared hard to see which side the clockwork stuck out, for he knew that people who jump generally have something to wind them up, but he couldn't see it. They were evidently a new kind of rabbit altogether. They stared at him, and the little rabbit stared back, and all the time their noses twitched. "Why don't you get up and play with us?" one of them asked. "I don't feel like it," said the rabbit, for he didn't want to explain that he had no clockwork. "Oh," said the furry rabbit, "it's as easy as anything." And he gave a big hop sideways and stood on his hind legs. "I don't believe you can," he said. "I can," said the little rabbit. "I can jump higher than anything." He meant when the boy threw him, but of course he didn't want to say so. "Can you hop on your hind legs?" asked the furry rabbit. That was a dreadful question, for the Velveteen Rabbit had no hind legs at all. The back of him was made all in one piece, like a pincushion. He sat still in the bracken and hoped that the other rabbits wouldn't notice. "I don't want to," he said again. But the wild rabbits have very sharp eyes, and this one stretched out his neck and looked. "He hasn't got any hind legs," he called out. "Fancy a rabbit without any hind legs." And he began to laugh. "I have," cried the little rabbit. "I have got hind legs. I'm sitting on them." "Then stretch them out and show me, like this," said the wild rabbit. And he began to whirl round and dance till the little rabbit got quite dizzy. "I don't like dancing," he said. "I'd rather sit still." But all the while he was longing to dance, for a funny new tickly feeling ran through him, and he felt like he would give anything in the world to be able to jump about like these rabbits did. The strange rabbit stopped dancing and came quite close. He came so close this time that his long whiskers brushed the Velveteen Rabbit's ear. And then he wrinkled his nose suddenly and flattened his ears and jumped backwards. "He doesn't smell right," he exclaimed. "He isn't a rabbit at all. He isn't real." "I am real," said the little rabbit. "I am real. The boy said so." And he nearly began to cry. Just then there was a sound of footsteps, and the boy ran past near them, and with a stamp of feet and a flash of white tails, the two strange rabbits disappeared. "Come back and play with me," called the little rabbit. "Oh, do come back. I know I am real." But there was no answer. Only the little ants ran to and fro, and the bracken swayed gently where the two strangers had passed. The Velveteen Rabbit was all alone. "Oh dear," he thought. "Why did they run away like that? Why couldn't they stop and talk to me?" For a long time he lay very still, watching the bracken, and hoping that they would come back. But they never returned, and presently the sun sank lower, and the little white moths fluttered out, and the boy came and carried him home. Weeks passed, and the little rabbit grew very old and shabby, but the boy loved him just as much. He loved him so hard that he loved all his whiskers off, and the pink lining to his ears turned gray, and his brown spots faded. He even began to lose his shape, and he scarcely looked like a rabbit anymore, except to the boy. To him, he was always beautiful, and that was all that the little rabbit cared about. He didn't mind how he looked to other people, because the nursery magic had made him real, and when you are real, shabbiness doesn't matter. And then, one day, the boy was ill. His face grew very flushed, and he talked in his sleep, and his little body was so hot that it burned the rabbit when he held him close. Strange people came and went in the nursery, and a light burned all night, and through it all the little Velveteen Rabbit lay there, hidden from sight under the bedclothes. And he never stirred, for he was afraid that if they found him, someone might take him away, and he knew that the boy needed him. It was a long, weary time, for the boy was too ill to play, and the little rabbit found it rather dull with nothing to do all day long. But he snuggled down patiently and looked forward to the time when the boy should be well again, and they would go out in the garden amongst the flowers and the butterflies and play splendid games in the raspberry thicket like they used to. All sorts of delightful things he planned, and while the boy lay half asleep, he crept up close to the pillow and whispered them in his ear. And presently, the fever turned, and the boy got better. He was able to sit up in bed and look at picture books, while the little rabbit cuddled close at his side. And one day they let him get up and dress. It was a bright, sunny morning, and the windows stood wide open. They had carried the boy out onto the balcony, wrapped in a shawl, and the little rabbit lay tangled up among the bedclothes, thinking. The boy was going to the seaside tomorrow. Everything was arranged, and now it only remained to carry out the doctor's orders. They talked about it all, while the little rabbit lay under the bedclothes with just his head peeping out, and listened. The room was to be disinfected, and all the books and toys that the boy had played with in bed must be burnt. "Hurrah!" thought the little rabbit. "Tomorrow we shall go to the seaside." For the boy had often talked of the seaside, and he wanted very much to see the big waves coming in, and the tiny crabs and the sandcastles. Just then Nana caught sight of him. "How about his old bunny?" she asked. "That," said the doctor. "Why, it's a mass of scarlet fever germs. Burn it at once." "What? Nonsense. Get him a new one. He mustn't have that anymore." And so, the little rabbit was put into a sack with the old picture books and a lot of rubbish, and carried out to the end of the garden beneath the fowl house. That was a fine place to make a bonfire, only the gardener was too busy just then to attend to it. He had the potatoes to dig and the green peas to gather, but next morning he promised to come quite early and burn the whole lot. That night, the boy slept in a different bedroom, and he had a new bunny to sleep with him. It was a splendid bunny, all white plush with real glass eyes, but the boy was too excited to care very much about it, for tomorrow he was going to the seaside, and that in itself was such a wonderful thing that he could think of nothing else. And while the boy was asleep, dreaming of the seaside, the little rabbit lay among the old picture books in the corner behind the fowl house, and he felt very lonely. The sack had been left untied, and so by wriggling a bit he was able to get his head through the opening and look out. He was shivering a little, for he had always been used to sleeping in a proper bed, and by this time his coat had worn so thin and threadbare from hugging that it was no longer any protection to him. Nearby he could see the thicket of raspberry canes, growing tall and close like a tropical jungle, in whose shadow he had played with the boy on bygone mornings. He thought of those long sunlit hours in the garden, how happy they were, and a great sadness came over him. He seemed to see them all pass before him, each more beautiful than the other. The fairy huts in the flower bed, the quiet evenings in the wood when he lay in the bracken and the little ants ran over his paws, the wonderful day when he first knew that he was real. He thought of the skin horse, so wise and gentle, and all that he had told him. Of what use was it to be loved and lose one's beauty and become real if it all ended like this? And a tear, a real tear, trickled down his shabby velvet nose and fell to the ground. And then a strange thing happened. For where the tear had fallen, a flower grew out of the ground, a mysterious flower, not at all like any that grew in the garden. It had slender green leaves the color of emeralds, and in the center of the leaves a blossom like a golden cup. It was so beautiful that the little rabbit forgot to cry, and just lay there watching it. And presently the blossom opened, and out of it there stepped a fairy. She was quite the loveliest fairy in the whole world. Her dress was of pearl and dewdrops, and there were flowers round her neck and in her hair, and her face was like the most perfect flower of all. And she came close to the little rabbit and gathered him up in her arms and kissed him on his velveteen nose that was all damp from crying. "Little rabbit," she said, "don't you know who I am?" The rabbit looked up at her, and it seemed to him that he had seen her face before, but he couldn't think where. "I am the nursery magic fairy," she said. "I take care of all the playthings that the children have loved. When they are old and worn out and the children don't need them anymore, then I come and take them away with me and turn them into real." "Wasn't I real before?" asked the little rabbit. "You were real to the boy," the fairy said, "because he loved you. Now you shall be real to everyone." And she held the little rabbit close in her arms and flew with him into the wood. It was light now, for the moon had risen. All the forest was beautiful, and the fronds of the bracken shone like frosted silver. In the open glade between the tree trunks, the wild rabbits danced with their shadows on the velvet grass. But when they saw the fairy, they all stopped dancing and stood round in a ring to stare at her. "I've brought you a new playfellow," the fairy said. "You must be very kind to him and teach him all he needs to know in Rabbitland, for he is going to live with you forever and ever." And she kissed the little rabbit again and put him down on the grass. "Run and play, little rabbit," she said. But the little rabbit sat quite still for a moment and never moved. For when he saw all the wild rabbits dancing around him, he suddenly remembered about his hind legs, and he didn't want them to see that he was made all in one piece. He did not know that when the fairy kissed him that last time she had changed him altogether. And he might have sat there a long time, too shy to move, if just then something hadn't tickled his nose. And before he thought what he was doing, he lifted his hind toe to scratch it. And he found that he actually had hind legs. Instead of dingy velveteen, he had brown fur, soft and shiny. His ears twitched by themselves, and his whiskers were so long that they brushed the grass. He gave one leap, and the joy of using those hind legs was so great that he went springing about the turf on them, jumping sideways and whirling around as the others did. And he grew so excited that when at last he did stop to look for the fairy, she had gone. He was a real rabbit at last, at home with the other rabbits. Autumn passed, and winter, and in the spring when the days grew warm and sunny, the boy went out to play in the wood behind the house. And while he was playing, 2 rabbits crept out from the bracken and peeped at him. One of them was brown all over, but the other had strange markings under his fur, as though long ago he had been spotted, and the spots still showed through. And about his little soft nose and his round black eyes, there was something familiar, so that the boy thought to himself, "Why, he looks just like my old bunny that was lost when I had scarlet fever." But he never knew that it really was his own bunny, come back to look at the child who had first helped him to be real. So that was the Velveteen Rabbit. A real good one? I agree. I've never actually read the entire story of the Velveteen Rabbit. It was really sweet, if a little bit sad in a lot of parts. Getting Pinocchio vibes from this one? I would agree. It does feel quite similar to Pinocchio. Although it's less about a little boy learning to do good than it is learning to embrace love in all of its forms. Because at first the rabbit was quite, I don't want to say arrogant, but he was very proud of how he looked. But he became less and less concerned with that sort of thing the more he was actually loved by somebody. It shows that your values can change so that it's less about appearance and material things and more just about connection. It's very cute. Okay. Do you guys want one more, or do you feel like you're able to fall asleep soon? The intent is to do this for my needy little siblings, so hopefully you're ready to go to sleep soon. But of course, if you're not, I will do my best to oblige. One more? Okay. The last one that I have is quite long, so hopefully this will be a good fit. This will be the last one though, okay? You have to promise you're going to go to sleep after this. Or at the very least, you'll be closer to going to sleep after this. Okay. So this story is called The White Doe. It is evidently a French fairy tale. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who loved each other dearly, and would have been perfectly happy if they had only a little son or daughter to play with. They never talked about it, and always pretended that there was nothing in the world to wish for. But sometimes, when they looked at other people's children, their faces grew sad, and their courtiers and attendants knew the reason why. One day, the queen was sitting alone by the side of a waterfall which sprung from some rocks in the large park adjoining the castle. She was feeling more than usually miserable, and had sent away her ladies so that no one might witness her grief. Suddenly, she heard a rustling movement in the pool below the waterfall, and on glancing up, she saw a large crab climbing onto a stone beside her. "Great Queen," said the crab, "I am here to tell you that the desire of your heart will soon be granted. But first you must permit me to lead you to the palace of the fairies, which, though hard by, has never been seen by mortal eyes because of the thick clouds that surround it. When there you will know more. That is, if you will trust yourself to me." The queen had never before heard an animal speak, and was struck dumb with surprise. However, she was so enchanted at the words of the crab that she smiled sweetly and held out her hand. It was taken not by the crab, which had stood there only a moment before, but by a little old woman smartly dressed in white and crimson with green ribbons in her gray hair. And, wonderful to say, not a drop of water fell from her clothes. The old woman ran lightly down a path along which the queen had been 100 times before, but it seemed so different she could hardly believe it was the same. Instead of having to push her way through nettles and brambles, roses and jasmine hung about her head, while under her feet the ground was sweet with violets. The orange trees were so tall and thick that even at midday, the sun was never too hot. And at the end of the path was a glimmer of something so dazzling that the queen had to shade her eyes and peep at it only between her fingers. "What can it be?" she asked, turning to her guide, who answered, "Oh, that is the fairies' palace, and here are some of them coming to meet us." As she spoke, the gates swung back, and 6 fairies approached, each bearing in her hand a flower made of precious stones, but so like a real one that it was only by touching you could tell the difference. "Madam," they said, "we know not how to thank you for this mark of your confidence, but have the happiness to tell you that in a short time you will have a little daughter." The queen was so enchanted at this news that she nearly fainted with joy, but when she was able to speak, she poured out all her gratitude to the fairies for their promised gift. "And now," she said, "I ought not to stay any longer, for my husband will think that I have run away, or that some evil beast has devoured me." In a little while it happened just as the fairies had foretold, and a baby girl was born in the palace. Of course, both the king and queen were delighted, and the child was called Desiree, which means desired, for she had been desired for 5 years before her birth. At first the queen could think of nothing but her new plaything, but then she remembered the fairies who had sent it to her. Bidding her ladies bring her the posy of jeweled flowers which had been given her at the palace, she took each flower in her hand and called it by name, and in turn each fairy appeared before her. But, as unluckily often happens, the one to whom she owed the most, the crab fairy, was forgotten, and by this, as in the case of other babies you have read about, much mischief was wrought. However, for the moment all was gaiety in the palace, and everybody inside ran to the windows to watch the fairies' carriages, for no 2 were alike. One had a car of ebony, drawn by white pigeons. Another was lying back in her ivory chariot, driving 10 black crows, while the rest had chosen rare woods or many-colored seashells, with scarlet and blue macaws, long-tailed peacocks, or green lovebirds for horses. These carriages were only used on occasions of state, for when they went to war, flying dragons, fiery serpents, lions, or leopards took the place of beautiful birds. The fairies entered the queen's chamber, followed by little dwarfs who carried their presents and looked much prouder than their mistresses. One by one, their burdens were spread upon the ground, and no one had ever seen such lovely things. Everything that a baby could possibly wear or play with was there, and besides, they had other and more precious gifts to give her, which only children who have fairies for godmothers can ever hope to possess. They were all gathered round the heap of pink cushions on which the baby lay asleep, when a shadow seemed to fall between them and the sun, while a cold wind blew through the room. Everybody looked up, and there was the crab fairy, who had grown as tall as the ceiling in her anger. "So I am forgotten!" cried she, in a voice so loud that the queen trembled as she heard it. "Who was it that soothed you in your trouble? Who was it that led you to the fairies? Who was it that brought you back in safety to your home again? Yet I am overlooked, while these who have done nothing in comparison are petted and thanked." The queen, almost dumb with terror, in vain tried to think of some explanation or apology. But there was none, and she could only confess her fault and implore forgiveness. The fairies also did their best to soften the wrath of their sister, and knowing that, like many plain people who are not fairies, she was very vain, they entreated her to drop her crab's disguise and to become once more the charming person they were accustomed to seeing. For some time, the enraged fairy would listen to nothing, but at length the flatteries began to take effect. The crab's shell fell from her, she shrank into her usual size, and lost some of her fierce expression. "Well," she said, "I will not cause the princess's death, as I had meant to do, but at the same time she will have to bear the punishment of her mother's fault, as many other children have done before her. The sentence I pass upon her is, that if she is allowed to see one ray of daylight before her 15th birthday, she will rue it bitterly, and it may perhaps cost her her life." And with these words she vanished by the window through which she came, while the fairies comforted the weeping queen and took counsel how best the princess might be kept safe during her childhood. At the end of half an hour, they had made up their minds what to do, and at the command of the fairies, a beautiful palace sprang up, close to that of the king and queen, but different from every palace in the world, and having no windows, and only a door right under the earth. However, once within, daylight was hardly missed, so brilliant were the multitudes of tapers that were burning on the walls. Now up to this time, the princess's history has been like the history of many a princess. But when the period of her imprisonment was nearly over, her fortunes took another turn. For almost 15 years, the fairies had taken care of her and amused her and taught her, so that when she came into the world she might be no whit behind the daughters of other kings in all that makes a princess charming and accomplished. They all loved her dearly, but the fairy Tulip loved her most of all. And as the princess's 15th birthday drew near, the fairy began to tremble lest something terrible should happen, some accident which had not been foreseen. "Do not let her out of your sight," said Tulip to the queen, "and meanwhile let her portrait be painted and carried to the neighboring courts, as is the custom, in order that the kings may see how far her beauty exceeds that of every other princess, and that they may demand her in marriage for their sons." And so it was done. And as the fairy had prophesied, all the young princes fell in love with the picture. But the last one to whom it was shown could think of nothing else, and refused to let it be removed from his chamber, where he spent whole days gazing at it. His father, the king, was much surprised at the change which had come over his son, who generally passed all his time in hunting or hawking, and his anxiety was increased by a conversation he overheard between two of his courtiers, that they feared the prince must be going out of his mind, so moody he had become. Without losing a moment, the king went to visit his son, and no sooner had he entered the room than the young man flung himself at his father's feet. "You have betrothed me already to a bride I can never love," cried he, "but if you will not consent to break off the match and ask for the hand of the Princess Desiree, I shall die of misery, thankful to be alive no longer." These words much displeased the king, who felt that in breaking off the marriage already arranged, he would almost certainly be bringing on his subjects a long and bloody war. So, without answering, he turned away, hoping that a few days might bring his son to reason. But the prince's condition grew rapidly so much worse that the king, in despair, promised to send an embassy at once to Desiree's father. This news cured the young man in an instant of all his ills, and he began to plan out every detail of dress and of horses and carriages which were necessary to make the train of the envoy, whose name was Bekasig, as splendid as possible. He longed to form part of the embassy himself, if only in the disguise of a page, but this the king would not allow, and so the prince had to content himself with searching the kingdom for everything that was rare and beautiful to send to the princess. Indeed, he arrived just as the embassy was starting with his portrait, which had been painted in secret by the court painter. The king and queen wished for nothing better than that their daughter marry into such a great and powerful family, and received the ambassador with every sign of welcome. They even wished him to see the Princess Desiree, but this was prevented by the fairy Tulip, who feared some ill might come of it. "And be sure you tell him," added she, "that the marriage cannot be celebrated till she is 15 years old, or else some terrible misfortune will happen to the child." So when Bekasig, surrounded by his train, made a formal request that the Princess Desiree might be given in marriage to his master's son, the king replied that he was much honored and would gladly give his consent, but that no one could even see the princess till her 15th birthday, as the spell laid upon her in her cradle by a spiteful fairy would not cease to work till that was past. The ambassador was greatly surprised and disappointed, but he knew too much about fairies to venture to disobey them. Therefore, he had to content himself with presenting the prince's portrait to the queen, who lost no time in carrying it to the princess. As the girl took it in her hands, it suddenly spoke, as it had been taught to do, and uttered a compliment of the most delicate and charming sort, which made the princess flush with pleasure. "How would you like to have a husband like that?" asked the queen, laughing. "As if I knew anything about husbands," replied Desiree, who had long guessed the business of the ambassador. "Well, he will be your husband in 3 months," answered the queen, ordering the prince's presents to be brought in. The princess was very pleased with them and admired them greatly, but the queen noticed that all the while her eyes constantly strayed from the softest silks and most brilliant jewels to the portrait of the prince. The ambassador, finding that there was no hope of his being allowed to see the princess, took his leave and returned to his own court. But here a new difficulty appeared. The prince, though transported with joy at the thought that Desiree was indeed to be his bride, was bitterly disappointed that she had not been allowed to return with Bekasig, as he had foolishly expected. And never having been taught to deny himself anything or to control his feelings, he fell as ill as he had done before. He would eat nothing nor take pleasure in anything, but lay all day on a heap of cushions, gazing at the picture of the princess. "If I have to wait 3 months before I can marry the princess, I shall die," was all the spoilt boy would say. Pathetic. That's just terrible. Sorry, I have to break character. That's just... Why is he like this? And at length the king, in despair, resolved to send a fresh embassy to Desiree's father to implore him to permit the marriage to be celebrated at once. I would have presented my prayer in person, he added in his letter, but my great age and infirmities do not suffer me to travel. However, my envoy has orders to agree to any arrangement that you may propose. On his arrival at the palace, Bekasig pleaded his young master's cause as fervently as the king his father could have done, and entreated that the princess might be consulted in the matter. The queen hastened to the marble tower and told her daughter of the sad state of the prince. Desiree sank down fainting at the news, but soon came to herself again, and set about inventing a plan which would enable her to go to the prince, without risking the doom pronounced over her by the wicked fairy. "I see," she exclaimed joyfully at last. "Let a carriage be built through which no light can come, and let it be brought into my room. I will then get into it, and we can travel swiftly during the night and arrive before dawn at the palace of the prince. Once there, I can remain in some underground chamber where no light can come." "Oh, how clever you are," cried the queen, clasping her in her arms, and she hurried away to tell the king. "What a wife our prince will have," said Bekasig, bowing low, "but I must hasten back with the tidings and to prepare the underground chamber for the princess." And so he took his leave. In a few days, the carriage commanded by the princess was ready. It was of green velvet, scattered over with large golden thistles, and lined inside with silver brocade embroidered with pink roses. It had no windows, of course, but the fairy tulip, whose counsel had been asked, had managed to light it up with a soft glow that came no one knew where. It was carried straight up into the great hall of the tower, and the princess stepped into it, followed by her faithful maid of honor, Eglantine, and by her lady-in-waiting, Sarasette, who had also fallen in love with the prince's portrait and was bitterly jealous of her mistress. The fourth place in the carriage was filled by Sarasette's mother, who had been sent by the queen to look after the three young people. We are very much getting into the politics of this story. I mentioned this was very long. It seems it's because they are giving us all of this information. Now, the Fairy of the Fountain was the godmother of the Princess Nera, to whom the prince had been betrothed before the picture of Desiree had made him faithless. She was very angry at the slight put upon her godchild, and from that moment kept careful watch on the princess. In this journey she saw her chance, and it was she who, invisible, sat by Sarasette, and put bad thoughts into the minds of both her and her mother. The way to the city where the prince lived ran for the most part through a thick forest, and every night, when there was no moon and not a single star could be seen through the trees, the guards who traveled with the princess opened the carriage to give it an airing. This went on for several days, till only 12 hours' journey lay between them and the palace. Sarasette persuaded her mother to cut a great hole in the side of the carriage with a sharp knife, which she herself had brought for the purpose. In the forest, the darkness was so intense that no one perceived what she had done, but when they left the last trees behind them and emerged into the open country, the sun was up, and for the first time since her babyhood, Desiree found herself in the light of day. She looked up in surprise at the dazzling brilliance that streamed through the hole, then gave a sigh which seemed to come from her heart. The carriage door swung back, as if by magic, and a White Doe sprang out, and in a moment was lost to sight in the forest. But, quick as she was, Eglantine, her maid of honor, had time to see where she went, and jumped from the carriage in pursuit of her, followed at a distance by the guards. Oh, so it's the princess who was turned into a doe, and not the queen. I thought the queen would be the one that was punished. Fair enough. Sarasette and her mother looked at each other in surprise and joy. They could hardly believe their good fortune, for everything had happened exactly as they wished. The first thing to be done was to conceal the hole which had been cut, and when this was managed, with the help of the angry fairy, though they did not know it, Sarasette hastened to take off her own clothes and put on those of the princess, placing the crown of diamonds on her head. She found this heavier than she expected, but then she had never been accustomed to wearing crowns, which makes all the difference. At the gates of the city, the carriage was stopped by a guard of honor sent by the king as an escort to his son's bride. Though Sarasette and her mother could of course see nothing of what was going on outside, they heard plainly the shouts of welcome from the crowds along the streets. The carriage stopped at length in the vast hall which Bekasig had prepared for the reception of the princess. The Grand Chamberlain and the Lord High Steward were awaiting her, and when the false bride stepped into the brilliantly lighted room, they bowed low, and said they had orders to inform His Highness the moment she arrived. The prince, whom the strict etiquette of the court had prevented from being present in the underground hall, was burning with impatience in his own apartments. "So she had come," cried he, throwing down the bow he had been pretending to mend. "Well, was I not right? Is she not a miracle of beauty and grace, and has she her equal in the whole world?" The ministers looked at each other and made no reply, till at length the chamberlain, who was the bolder of the two, observed, "My lord, as to her beauty, you can judge of that for yourself. No doubt it is as great as you say, but at present it seems to have suffered, as is natural, from the fatigues of the journey." This was certainly not what the prince had expected to hear. Could the portrait have flattered her? He had known of such things before, and a cold shiver ran through him, but with an effort he kept silent from further questioning and only said, "Has the king been told that the princess is in the palace?" "Yes, Highness, and he has probably already joined her." "Then I will go too," said the prince. Weak as he was from his long illness, the prince descended the staircase, supported by the ministers, and entered the room just in time to hear his father's loud cry of astonishment and disgust at the sight of Cerisette. "There has been treachery at work," he exclaimed, while the prince leaned dumb with horror against the doorpost. But the lady-in-waiting, who had been prepared for something of the sort, advanced, holding in her hand the letters with which the king and queen had entrusted to her. "This is the Princess Desiree," said she, pretending to have heard nothing, "and I have the honor to present to you these letters from my liege lord and lady, together with the casket containing the princess's jewels." The king did not move or answer her, so the prince, leaning on the arm of Bekasik, approached a little closer to the false princess, hoping against hope that his eyes had deceived him. But the longer he looked, the more he agreed with his father that there was treason somewhere, for in no single respect did the portrait resemble the woman before him. Cerisette was so tall that the dress of the princess did not reach her ankles, and so thin that her bones showed through the stuff. In his turn, the prince stood rooted to the spot. At last he spoke, and his words were addressed to his father and not to the bride who had come so far to marry him. "We have been deceived," he said, "and it will cost me my life." And he leaned so heavily on the envoy that Bekasik feared he was going to faint and hastily laid him on the floor. For some minutes no one could attend to anybody but the prince, but as soon as he revived, the lady-in-waiting made herself heard. "Oh, my lovely princess, why did we ever leave home?" cried she. "But the king, your father, will avenge the insults that have been heaped on you when we tell him how you have been treated." "I will tell him myself," replied the king in wrath. "He promised me a wonder of beauty. He has sent me a skeleton. I am not surprised that he has kept her for 15 years hidden away from the eyes of the world. Take them both away," he continued, turning to his guards, "and lodge them in the state prison. There's something more I have to learn of this matter." My goodness, calling her a skeleton? I mean, it did describe that she's very skinny. Well, that's what happens when you try to fool royalty. What did they think was going to happen? They knew that the prince saw the portrait, right? Like, people know this? How dumb can you be? This is like Sleeping Beauty, but bad. Sleeping Beauty / like Swan Princess, I guess. It's something like that. We are like halfway through, by the way. Whew. Jailed for ugly crimes. Exactly. It's so strange. His orders were obeyed, and the prince, loudly bewailing his sad fate, was led back to bed, where for many days he lay in a high fever. At length he slowly began to gain strength, but his sorrow was still so great that he could not bear the sight of a strange face, and shuddered at the notion of taking his proper part in the court ceremonies. Unknown to the king, or to anybody but Bekasig, he planned that as soon as he was able, he would make his escape and pass the rest of his life alone in some solitary place. It was some weeks before he had regained his health sufficiently to carry out his design. But finally, one beautiful starlit night, the two friends stole away, and when the king woke next morning, he found a letter lying by his bed saying that his son had gone he knew not whither. He wept bitter tears at the news, for he loved the prince dearly, but he felt that perhaps the young man had done wisely, and he trusted to time and Bekasig's influence to bring the wanderer home. And while these things were happening, what had become of the White Doe? Though when she sprang from the carriage she was aware that some unkind fate had changed her into an animal, yet till she saw herself in a stream, she had no idea what it was. Is it really I, Desiree? She said to herself, weeping. What wicked fairy can have treated me so? And shall I never, never take my own shape again? My only comfort that in this great forest full of lions and serpents my life will be a short one. Now, the fairy Tulip was as much grieved at the sad fate of the princess as Desiree's own mother could have been, if she had known of it. Still, she could not help feeling that if the king and queen had listened to her advice, the girl would by this time be safely in the walls of her new home. However, she loved Desiree too much to let her suffer more than could be helped, and it was she who guided Eglantine to the place where the White Doe was standing, cropping the grass which was her dinner. At the sound of footsteps, the pretty creature lifted her head. When she saw her faithful companion approaching, she bounded towards her and rubbed her head on Eglantine's shoulder. The maid of honor was surprised, but she was fond of animals and stroked the White Doe tenderly, speaking gently to her all the while. Suddenly, the beautiful creature lifted her head and looked up into Eglantine's face with tears streaming from her eyes. A thought flashed through her mind, and quick as lightning the girl flung herself on her knees and, lifting the animal's feet, kissed them one by one. "My princess! Oh, my dear princess!" cried she. And again the White Doe rubbed her head against her, for though the spiteful fairy had taken away her power of speech, she had not deprived her of her reason. All day long the two remained together, and when Eglantine grew hungry, she was led by the White Doe to a part of the forest where pears and peaches grew in abundance. But as night came on, the maid of honor was filled with the terrors of wild beasts, which had beset the princess during her first night in the forest. "Is there no hut or cave we could go into?" asked she, but the doe only shook her head, and the two sat down and wept with fright. The fairy Tulip, who in spite of her anger was very soft-hearted, was touched at their distress and flew quickly to their help. "I cannot take away the spell altogether," she said, "for the fairy of the fountain is stronger than I, but I can shorten the time of your punishment, and am able to make it less hard, for as soon as darkness falls you shall resume your own shape." To think that by and by she would cease to be a White Doe, indeed that she would at once cease to be one during the night, was for the present joy enough for Desiree, and she skipped about on the grass in the prettiest manner. "Go straight down the path in front of you," continued the fairy, smiling as she watched her. "Go straight down the path and you will soon reach a little hut where you will find shelter." With these words she vanished, leaving her hearers happier than they ever thought they could be again. An old woman was standing at the door of the hut when Eglantine drew near, with the White Doe trotting by her side. "Good evening," she said. "Could you give me a night's lodging for myself and my doe?" "Certainly I can," replied the old woman, and she led them into a room with two little white beds, so clean and comfortable that it made you sleepy even to look at them. The door had hardly closed behind the old woman when the sun sank below the horizon, and Desiree became a girl again. "Oh, Eglantine, what should I have done if you had not followed me?" she cried, and she flung herself into her friend's arms in a transport of delight. Early in the morning, Eglantine was awakened by the sound of someone scratching at the door, and on opening her eyes she saw the White Doe struggling to get out. The little creature looked up and into her face, and nodded her head as the maid of honor unfastened the latch, but bounded away into the woods and was lost to sight in a moment. Meanwhile, the prince and Bekasig were wandering through the wood, till at last the prince grew so tired that he laid down under a tree, and told Bekasig that he had better go in search of food and of some place where they could sleep. Bekasig had not gone very far, when a turn of the path brought him face to face with the old woman, who was feeding her doves before her cottage. "Could you give me some milk and fruit?" asked he. "I am very hungry myself, and besides, I have left a friend behind me who is still weak from illness." "Certainly I can," answered the old woman, "but come and sit down in my kitchen while I catch the goat and milk it." Bekasig was glad enough to do as he was bid, and in a few minutes the old woman returned with a basket brimming over with oranges and grapes. "If your friend has been ill, he should not pass the night in the forest," said she. "I have room in my hut. Tiny enough, it is true, but better than nothing, and to that you are both heartily welcome." Bekasig thanked her warmly, and as by this time it was almost sunset, he set out to fetch the prince. It was while he was absent that Eglantine and the White Doe entered the hut, and having of course no idea that in the very next room was the man whose childish impatience had been the cause of all their troubles. In spite of his fatigue, the prince slept badly, and directly it was light he rose, and bidding Bekasig remain where he was, as he wished to be alone, he strolled out into the forest. He walked on slowly, just as his fancy led him, till suddenly he came to a wide open space, and in the middle was the White Doe quietly eating her breakfast. She bounded off at the sight of a man, but not before the prince, who had fastened on his bow without thinking, had let fly several arrows, which the fairy tulip took care should do her no harm. But, quickly as she ran, she soon felt her strength failing her, for 15 years of life in a tower had not taught her how to exercise her limbs. Luckily, the prince was too weak to follow her far, and a turn of a path brought her close to the hut, where Eglantine was awaiting her. Panting for breath, she entered their room and flung herself down on the floor. When it was dark again and she was once more the Princess Desiree, she told Eglantine what had befallen her. "I feared the fairy of the fountain and the cruel beasts," said she, "but somehow I never thought of the dangers that I ran from men. I do not know now what saved me." "You must stay quietly here till the time of your punishment is over," answered Eglantine. But when the morning dawned and the girl turned into a doe, the longing for the forest came over her, and she sprang away as before. When you are able to behave while you are in your human form, but the minute you become a deer, you have deer brain, and deer brain wants you to go eat grass. Amazing. Logic and reason? Didn't the story literally say like 6 paragraphs ago that she was able to maintain her reason despite being turned into a doe? Maybe not anymore. Life is rough when you are a 15-year-old that has turned into a deer. Apparently. Why are you saying that's relatable? That is not relatable to me. I do not have a sudden urge to touch grass. Could never be me. As soon as the prince was awake, he hastened to the place where only the day before he had found the White Doe feeding. But of course she had taken care to go in the opposite direction. Much disappointed, he tried first one green path and then another, and at last, weary with walking, he threw himself down and went fast asleep. Just at this moment, the White Doe sprang out of a thicket nearby, and started back trembling when she beheld her enemy lying there. Yet instead of turning to fly, something bade her go and look at him unseen. As she gazed, a thrill ran through her, for she felt that, worn and wasted though he was by illness, it was the face of her destined husband. "Hello, Miki-chan. Hello, Raiders. Welcome. I am reading Bedtime stories. I'm in the middle of the last one that has been quite long. Hopefully you will be able to handle the story without any context, but thank you very much for the raid. I hope you guys had a good stream. Welcome, welcome." Gently stooping over him, she kissed his forehead, and at her touch he awoke. For a minute they looked at each other, and to his amazement he recognized the White Doe which had escaped him the previous day. But in an instant, the animal was aroused to a sense of her danger, and she fled with all her strength into the thickest part of the forest. Quick as lightning, the prince was on her track, but this time it was with no wish to kill or even wound the beautiful creature. Pretty doe, stop! I won't hurt you," cried he, but his words were carried away by the wind. At length, the doe could run no more, and when the prince reached her, she was lying stretched out on the grass, waiting for her death blow. But instead the prince knelt at her side and stroked her, and bade her fear nothing as he would take care of her. So he fetched a little water from the stream in his horn-hunting cup. Then, cutting some branches from the trees, he twisted them into a litter which he covered with moss, and laid the White Doe gently on it. For a long time they remained thus, but when Desiree saw by the way that the light struck the trees that the sun must be near its setting, she was filled with alarm lest the darkness should fall and the prince should behold her in her human shape. "No, he must not see me for the first time here," she thought, and instantly began to plan how to get rid of him. Then she opened her mouth and let her tongue hang out, as if she were dying of thirst, and the prince, as she expected, hastened to the stream to get her some more water. When he returned, the White Doe was gone. That night, Desiree confessed to Eglantine that her pursuer was no other than the prince, and that far from flattering him, the portrait had never done him justice. "Is it not hard to meet him in this shape," wept she, "when we both love each other so much?" But Eglantine comforted her, and reminded her that in a short time all would be well. The prince was very angry at the flight of the White Doe, for whom he had taken so much trouble, and returning to the cottage he poured out his adventures and his wrath to Bekasi, who could not help smiling. "She shall not escape me again," cried the prince. "If I hunt her every day for a year, I will have her at last." And in this frame of mind, he went to bed. When the White Doe entered the forest next morning, she had not made up her mind whether she would go and meet the prince, or whether she would shun him, and hide in thickets of which he knew nothing. She decided that the last plan was the best, and so it would have been if the prince had not taken the very same direction in search of her. Quite by accident, he caught sight of her white skin shining through the bushes. At the same instant, she heard a twig snap under his feet. In a moment she was up and away, but the prince, not knowing how else to capture her, aimed an arrow at her leg, which brought her to the ground. The young man felt like a murderer, and he ran hastily up to where the White Doe lay and did his best to soothe the pain she felt, which in reality was the last part of the punishment sent by the fairy of the fountain. First he brought her some water, and then he fetched some healing herbs, and having crushed them in his hand, laid them on the wound. "Ah, what a wretch I was to have hurt you," cried he, resting his head upon his knees. "And now you will hate me and fly from me forever." For some time the doe lay quietly where she was, but as before, she remembered that the hour of her transformation was near. She struggled to her feet, but the prince would not hear of her walking, and thinking the old woman might be able to dress her wound better than he could, he took her in his arms to carry her back to the hut. But, small as she was, she made herself so heavy that after staggering a few steps under her weight, he laid her down and tied her fast to a tree with some of the ribbons of his hat. With this done, he went away to get help. Meanwhile, Eglantine had grown very uneasy at the long absence of her mistress and had come out to look for her. Just as the prince passed out of sight, the fluttering ribbons danced before her eyes, and she descried her beautiful princess bound to a tree. With all her might she worked at the knots, but not a single one could she undo, though all appeared so easy. She was still busy with them when a voice behind her said, "Pardon me, fair lady, but it is my doe you are trying to steal." "Excuse me, good knight," answered Eglantine, hardly glancing at him, "but it is my doe that is tied up here, and if you wish for a proof of it, you can see if she knows me or not. Touch my heart, little one," she continued, dropping on her knees. And the doe lifted up its forefoot and laid it on her side. "Now put your arms round my neck and sigh." And again the doe did as she was bid. "You are right," said the prince, "but it is with sorrow I give her up to you, for though I have wounded her yet, I love her deeply." To this Eglantine answered nothing, but carefully raising up the doe, she led her slowly to the hut. Now both the prince and Bekasi were quite unaware that the old woman had any guests besides themselves, and following afar were much surprised to behold Eglantine and her charge entering the cottage. They lost no time in questioning the old woman, who replied that she knew nothing about the lady and her white doe, who slept next to the chamber occupied by the prince and his friend, but that they were very quiet and paid her well. Then she went back to her kitchen. "Do you know," said Bekasi when they were alone, "I am certain that the lady we saw is the maid of honor to the Princess Desiree, whom I met at the palace. And as her room is next to this, it will be easy to make a small hole through which I can satisfy myself whether I am right or not." So, taking a knife out of his pocket, he began to saw away the woodwork. The girls heard the grating noise, but fancying it was a mouse, paid no attention, and Bekasi was left in peace to pursue his work. At length the hole was large enough for him to peep through, and the sight was one to strike him dumb with amazement. He had guessed truly. The tall lady was Eglantine herself, but the other, where had he seen her? Ah, now he knew. It was the lady of the portrait. Oh, the reveal. Desiree, in a flowing dress of green silk, was lying stretched out upon cushions, and as Eglantine bent over her to bathe the wounded leg, she began to talk. "Oh, let me die," cried she, "rather than going on leading this life. You cannot tell the misery of being a beast all the day and unable to speak to the man I love, to whose impatience I owe my cruel fate. Yet even so, I cannot bring myself to hate him." Peepers peepin'. Indeed, and they're just assuming it's a mouse. These words, low though they were spoken, reached Bekasi, who could hardly believe his ears. He stood silent for a moment. Then, crossing to the window out of which the prince was gazing, he took his arm and led him across the room. A single glance was sufficient to show the prince that it was indeed Desiree, and how another had come to the palace bearing her name. At that instant he neither knew nor cared. Stealing on tiptoe from the room, he knocked at the next door, which was opened by Eglantine, who thought it was the old woman bearing their supper. She started back at the sight of the prince, whom this time she also recognized, but he thrust her aside and flung himself at the feet of Desiree, to whom he poured out all his heart. Dawn found them still conversing, and the sun was high in the heavens before the princess perceived that she retained her human form. Ah, how happy she was when she knew that the days of her punishment were over. And with a glad voice she told the prince the tale of her enchantment. So the story ended well after all, and the fairy Tulip, who turned out to be the old woman of the hut, made the young couple such a wedding feast as had never been seen since the world began. And everybody was delighted, except Saraset and her mother, who were put in a boat and carried to a small island where they had to work hard for their living. What an ending. I love how it just focuses on the two perceived villains. Amazing. Everyone lived happily ever after, except for these two people who were a problem like 18 paragraphs ago, who are now suffering on an island performing manual labor. What did we learn, children? The first and second half of the story felt like different people wrote them. I wouldn't be surprised. Well, it says there was only one author, but maybe it was translated by different people. It does feel like it had a tonal shift. Actions equals consequences. That's fair. That's a good assessment. Learned the prince might be a furry. Don't say that. He just thought that the doe was pretty. Would you not be excited to also see a white doe? That's funny, though. I like that. Well, yes, in the end, everybody was in fact happy. What a wild story, this one. I liked that the princess's carriage has Yuno's color scheme. I was kind of thinking that in my head. I was just like, oh, why is this carriage built after me? Am I Desiree? We learned, if you act like that, Yuno will call you pathetic. Yeah, no. I will, though. What was that behavior? Dude was a little silly. Family. Thank you, Vin Diesel. Very cool. Although I guess the story is more about friendship, because it's through the friends that the prince and princess were able to finally meet. I hope Yuno calls me... Why? Why are you like this? I don't think you want to hear such insults from your big sister, do you? If so, there might be a few things we need to unpack. And by a few, I mean a lot. Therapy. Literally the friends they made along the way. I suppose so. Though those were friends that they had, like, beforehand, too. Like, before they went on their journeys. Unpacking New Game Plus run? Not sure what that means. Are you asking me to play Unpacking again? Is there any benefit to doing a New Game Plus? I would assume not. I was making a joke about how much there would be to unpack. Oh, I understand now. Yes, no, therapy, for sure. Alright, well, this has been several bedtime stories. I hope that I was able to, at the very least, entertain you, if not prepare you to get ready for bed. I'm sure that for some people, in your time zone, it might not necessarily be bedtime, but I hope that this was relaxing nonetheless. Plus, you can always come back to this whenever you do actually need bedtime stories. Sounds like Onee-san is sleepy too. I was a little bit sleepy even before this, yes. I am very much looking forward to finishing what I need to do and going to bed. But thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you were able to enjoy the stories. I know I had fun reading the stories to you. Alright, well, I will be seeing you tomorrow with another stream at our usual time. I hope you will have a good rest of your time zone. And until I am able to see you again, Yunotsu.